The Orc labor masters arrived at Ashwick Station on the 9th day of the harvest drought, when the wells had gone to mud at the bottom, and the grain bins held less than a week's worth. 6 of them rode in on iron-shod draft mounts that smelled of axle grease and the long southern road, heavy-shouldered and gray-green skinned, wearing the bronze-banded harnesses of the Vorgath Collective. Their leader carried a sealed writ in a brass tube, and the tube bore the provincial charter emblem, and no human settlement south of the Iron Marches was legally permitted to refuse a charter writ. Sergeant Callum Rowe had been constable of Ashwick for 9 years. He had seen 2 floods, 1 borderland incursion, and a winter fever that had taken 11 people in 6 weeks. He had, in 9 years, developed what his deputy called the face, a specific expression of measured steadiness he put on when a situation was moving toward something he couldn't stop with his hands and would have to address with his head. He was wearing the face when the lead orc dismounted in the square. Her name was Gruka. He would learn that later. At first introduction she was simply the speaker, wide-jawed, bronze-eyed, carrying the writ tube with the proprietary ease of a woman who had done this many times before and expected no surprises. She placed the tube on the station railing without drama and said, in the flat, carrying voice of someone used to being heard, "Charter labor assessment for Ashwick settlement. Sergeant is required to witness the intake procedures." Callum took the tube. He uncapped it. He read the writ inside, which was 4 pages of dense charter language, 3 times through, not because he failed to understand it the first time, but because he had found over the years that reading things 3 times slowed the clock, and a slowed clock gave you something to work with. The writ authorized collection of 43 adults, minimum 2-year indenture, reporting to the Vorgath Collective's Northern Labor Division for infrastructure work in the expanded Southern Reach. It listed the standard exemption categories. It was signed by the Deputy Provincial Commissioner and countersealed with the Collective's stamp. It was, in every legal sense, airtight. He rolled it back into the tube and handed it to Gruka. "I need a day," he said. She received the tube with the flat attention of someone who had heard every variation of that sentence. "The charter does not require a grace period," she said. "Assessment begins at first light. You are required to witness and sign." "I need a day." She looked at him the way an experienced appraiser looks at livestock she has already decided on, not unkindly, just finished. Then she nodded once, the nod of someone conceding a minor point, and turned to direct her team toward the square. He stood in the station doorway and watched them set up their assessment tables, and he thought about Myra Ashving. He thought about her for exactly as long as it took to form an intention. Then he went to find her. He had met her 4 years ago in the chaos of the Southern Reach resettlement, when the Vorgath's expansion had pushed 300 people north in 2 weeks, and the constabulary at Ashwick had been designated a processing point, whether it was prepared for the role or not. Callum had been 28 and 3 months into the constable's post, and very much not prepared, but he had been learning to operate above his preparation level, which is a different and more useful skill. Myra had come in the middle of the second day's wave. She was 25, dark-haired, with the upright carriage of someone who had decided, somewhere in the last week, he would later understand that she simply was not going to fall down in front of the 2 children who depended on her. She was carrying a girl of 10 on her back and holding a 7-year-old boy by the hand, and both children were silent with the particular silence of children who have learned not to make demands on a person they can see is running on empty. She had come to his station window and said, "I need to report 2 minors as my dependents. Their mother, my sister, didn't make it. I need to know what documentation I need to establish guardianship under provisional resettlement status." Not help me, not, I don't know what to do. She had arrived knowing what she needed and asking for the procedure to get it. He had given her a billet for a week, while the resettlement office cleared the backlog. At the end of the week she had still been there, having reorganized his filing system, corrected 3 errors in the intake forms, and begun a cross-reference ledger linking the registration numbers to the dependent status categories in a way that saved him approximately 4 hours of weekly administrative work. He had asked her to stay on as a charter administrator. She had agreed with the practicality of someone who recognizes a good arrangement and doesn't pretend otherwise. She was good at everything she turned her attention to. She was precise and fast, and she had a quality of mind he couldn't quite name at first. It was only later he found the word for it: synthetic. She took disparate things and made connections between them that other people didn't see until she pointed them out, and even then they often couldn't trace the path she'd taken to get there. She read charter law the way some people read novels, for pleasure and then for leverage. 2 years in, she had reorganized the grain allocation system, negotiated a better tribute rate with the collective's local agent, and trained Davin, the 17-year-old grain clerk, into something approaching a competent administrator. She had also, in the evenings, tutored her niece Lena in collective charter law and her nephew Tam in provincial surveying techniques, because Myra Ashvin ran on purpose the way some engines run on coal, and she needed it constantly to keep going. 2 years in, during an argument about the quarterly grain reports, she said the column headings were wrong. He said they had always been that way. She produced the original charter documentation proving she was right. He had looked at her across the table in the lantern light and understood, with the sudden clarity of something that had been true for a while and was only now being acknowledged, that he was in love with her. He had said nothing. He had changed the column headings and gone to bed. She knew. She had the kind of intelligence that made not knowing impossible, and he had the kind of face that was only opaque to strangers. But they had held the unspoken thing between them with the mutual, careful practicality of 2 people who understood that naming it would change the entire weight distribution of everything they were managing, and neither of them was certain they could afford that shift right now. He had been waiting for a better moment. He had been telling himself, soon, when things settle, when the drought eases, when the tribute negotiation is resolved. The labor writ ended the waiting. He found her at the grain office, where she was doing what she always did when a situation was going badly, working. The lantern was burning even though there was still an hour of daylight left in the sky. She was at the tallying table with the quarterly records in front of her, her pen moving with the focused, controlled energy of someone using precision as a wall against panic. Davin was in the corner, pale and still. He was 17 and from a family that had been in Ashwick for 3 generations, and the concept of being assessed and taken south had rendered him temporarily non-functional. "They'll take everyone," he said. "My whole family except my mother because she's over 55, but Jana is 22 and my brother is." "We're working on it," Callum said. "How the writ is?" "We're working on it, Davin." Myra looked up. She had steady gray eyes, the color of weathered stone, worn smooth by long exposure to hard things. No panic in them. He had never seen panic in her eyes, only the particular alertness of a mind that was already moving. "The writ is legal," she said. "Yes." "The exemption categories are narrow." "Yes, I've been through them. 6 people qualify on existing grounds. 37 exposed." 35, he said. 2 of the names on the assessment list are dependents of exempt households. I can challenge the inclusion. 35 then. She set her pen down and looked at him across the grain office with the full attention she gave to problems. "The charter recognizes 5 exemption categories. We know which ones apply. The question is whether there are other categories we're not currently using." "Bond registration," he said. She was very still. "Bonded couples are exempt," he said. "The social stability clause. It's the same clause that covers single parents. The collective doesn't want to break functional household units because it creates downstream instability that affects productivity metrics." That would cover one person, she said. If you're suggesting what I think you're suggesting, it covers you. He said it flatly because there was no graceful way to approach this, and he had never been the kind of man who tried to dress a thing up past the point of honesty. It covers you specifically because you're the person on that list I cannot lose. He paused. Not for the township's sake, for mine. The lantern flame made small movements in the still air of the grain office. Outside, he could hear Gruka's voice carrying across the square, that flat appraiser's tone reading numbers. Myra looked at him with the steady gray eyes. She looked at him for long enough that Davin became very interested in the wall behind him. Callum, she said, this is not a good reason to. I know. An emergency bond registration under labor assessment pressure is not. It doesn't constitute a. Myra. He said her name with everything underneath it, all 4 years of it, the arguments about the grain records and the evening light on the hill above the township and the carved box in the second drawer that she thought he hadn't noticed. I am not asking because of the writ. The writ is an occasion. I have been waiting for a better time, and I have now concluded that there isn't one. There is never going to be one. There is only this right now in the grain office with the Vorgeth assessment tables 50 meters away. He met her eyes. I'm asking because it's true. I should have asked 2 years ago. I am asking now. The silence lasted long enough to be a real silence. Then she said, the charter bond requires 2 witnesses. Davin. 2. He put his head out the door and whistled at Aldrich the Cooper across the lane, who appeared with the expression of a man who had been watching the assessment team set up their tables with considerable anxiety, and was now being asked to take on an additional complication. I need you to witness a bond registration, Callum said. Aldrich looked at him, looked at the grain office, looked back at the square. Right now, he said. Right now. Aldrich crossed the lane without another question, because he was a practical man who had been in Ashwick long enough to understand that when Sergeant Rose said something needed doing right now, arguing about timing was a waste of everyone's time. The registration took 11 minutes. It was done on the grain office table with the charter ledger open to the correct page, and Davin holding the lantern steady with both hands. Aldrich signed in the witness column with the gravity of a man who understood, even under the circumstances, that this was the kind of thing that deserved to be done correctly. When it was sealed and recorded, Myra closed the ledger. She held it for a moment with both hands on the cover, as if taking a measurement of it. Then she said, all right, now we deal with the rest. The rest was 35 names. They worked through the night, Callum and Myra and Davin, with the lantern burning on the grain office table and the Vorgeth assessment team's torches visible through the window. Myra had already been thinking about the charter exemptions for hours before he arrived. He could tell by the way she moved through the problem, not as if she was discovering the angles, but as if she was recovering them from a map she'd already drawn. The collective charter recognizes apprenticeship bonds, she said. A registered master-apprentice relationship creates a dependency classification under the social stability exemption. Same clause family. You can't file apprenticeship registrations overnight. You can't file 40 in a normal situation, but the charter has an emergency filing provision, Section 14, Skills Shortage Emergency Designation. A settlement officer who certifies a qualifying emergency has 72 hours to complete associated registrations. What qualifies as a skills shortage emergency? Among other things, a drought-related resource crisis that threatens the settlement's productive capacity. She looked at him steadily. We have a drought. We have a crisis. You are the settlement officer. If you certify the designation, we have 3 days. He thought about this. How many apprenticeships can we file in 3 days? There are 8 registered trade masters in Ashwick. Charter statute allows up to 4 active apprentices per master without additional collective licensing. 8 masters, 4 each, 32 slots. 3 short. Aldrich the Cooper has an unused secondary license from before the resettlement. He was training in a second specialty and never formally closed the registration. If he activates it tonight, he has 4 additional slots. She tilted her head. That puts us at 36, with 1 to spare. Davin, who had been following this with his mouth slightly open, said, "But some of those people have never done an apprenticeship in there." "They don't need to have done one before," Myra said. "They need to be registered. The collective doesn't audit active apprenticeship work during the emergency period. They check the paperwork." She looked at Callum. "The law is the law in both directions." He went and woke the 8 trade masters of Ashwick. It was the kind of night that carves itself into a place's memory. He went door to door in the dark, while Myra drafted the registration forms at a speed that would have been impressive under normal conditions, and bordered on supernatural under these ones. The trade masters were frightened and willing, both in proportion to how well they understood what was happening. Aldrich, who understood it best, pulled out his secondary license from a box of old papers and signed the activation with hands that were completely steady. By the time the sky was beginning to gray in the east, 22 registrations were filed. By mid-morning of the first day, 30. By evening, all 35. Gruka came to him at dusk on the first day. She came without her team, which Callum had learned to read as a signal of relative candor. The Vorgath assessors performed differently in their professional formation than they did one-on-one. "The emergency designation is legitimate," she said, which was not a concession but an acknowledgement. "We will wait the charter period." "Thank you," he said. "Do not thank me." She looked at the township square, at the lights coming on in the windows, at the people moving carefully around the assessment tables as if the tables were sleeping animals. "It is charter procedure." "Nevertheless." She turned her flat brass eyes on him. "You are going to fight us for every name on that list." "Yes." "The registrations will hold for the appeal period. They will not hold forever. The collective will return next cycle." "I know." He met her eyes without flinching. "But I have a very intelligent wife, 3 days of charter procedure, and full access to the Section 14 documentation. We'll be here when you come back." She studied him with the measuring attention she applied to everything. Then she turned and went back to her team, and Callum stood in the cooling air of the square and thought. She was right that 3 days wasn't 3 years. She was right that this was a temporary hold on a permanent problem. But Myra was already working on the permanent problem. She had been working on it, he suspected, since before the assessment team arrived. The second day was worse than the first in some ways and better in others. Worse because the waiting had a physical texture to it. The township moved around the assessment tables with the strained normalcy of a place under occupation. People went to work. Children went to lessons. The grain office opened, and the cooperage opened, and the smithy opened. But all of it had the quality of performance, of people acting ordinary because ordinariness was the only comfort they had access to. Callum spent the day managing pressure. The Vorgath junior assessors were subtle. They didn't threaten or demand. They simply talked to people, one at a time, in the manner of someone having a friendly conversation. He recognized the technique. It was designed to surface information about vulnerabilities, relationships, dependencies, the texture of a community, which could later be used to identify who would be easiest to move. He inserted himself into 4 such conversations and ended them. The junior assessors gave him looks that were professionally neutral. Gruka watched from across the square without comment. Better because, on the evening of the second day, Myra showed him what she'd been building under the surface. She spread the documents on the grain office table and walked him through it, and he had the experience he always had when she showed him something she'd been working on, the experience of watching an architecture become visible, of understanding retroactively that the separate pieces he'd been observing had always been part of a larger structure, and he simply hadn't seen the shape until she turned it toward the light. She had been analyzing the Vorgeth Collective's assessment records for 3 years. Not just Ashwick's, all the settlements in the southern marches. She had obtained copies of the charter filings through the Provincial Records Office, a perfectly legal process that nobody else had thought to bother with because it was tedious, and the documents were dense, and most settlement officers had more immediate problems to manage. What she had found was a pattern. The collective's labor quota model is calibrated on extraction, she said. Short-term labor value. They assess annually, and they take the people who are most productive individually but least structurally embedded, young, skilled, without extensive family networks. They're optimizing for the immediate value of the labor, not for the long-term health of the settlement. We knew this, he said. Yes, but here's what I found in the 10-year data. She placed 2 sets of numbers side by side. Settlements that have been through repeated labor assessment cycles show a consistent productivity decline over 7 to 12 years. The collective's own metrics show this. They take the most capable people, the settlements degrade, the tribute payments decrease, and the collective's net return on the extraction drops below what they'd have gotten from a stable, contributing settlement. He looked at the numbers. They're aware of this. The field assessors are aware of it. It's noted in several internal assessment reports I found through the Public Charter Archive. It's a known problem. She tapped the documents. But the collective's bureaucratic incentive structure rewards quota completion, not long-term outcome. The assessors are evaluated on successful collections, not on settlement health 10 years later. So they keep doing the thing that makes them individually successful and collectively counterproductive. Yes, which means there is a version of this argument that can be made to the people in the collective who are evaluated on the long-term outcomes. She looked at him. Not to Gruka. She is an enforcement officer and her incentives are different. But the collective has a regional development division that is specifically responsible for settlement sustainability metrics. They have an interest, a documented, data-supported interest, in a different approach. How do we get to them? Through the charter reclassification system. There's a Tier 2 designation. I found it buried in Appendix 4 of the Regional Development Charter, for settlements that demonstrate above-average resource management and social stability. Tier 2 reduces the labor quota by 60% and extends the assessment cycle to 3 years. She laid a third document on top of the others. Ashwick qualifies. We qualified before the assessment team arrived. The application process requires documentation that we already have. He stared at her for a long moment. You've been building this application for how long? He said. About 18 months. She said it without apology, but also without smugness, just the flat precision of someone reporting a fact. I didn't know if it would be necessary. I hoped it wouldn't, but the drought conditions suggested the risk was elevated, and I prefer to have the architecture ready before it's needed rather than building it during the emergency. He looked at the documents on the table. He looked at her. You planned for this, he said. I planned for the possibility. There's a difference. She paused, although in practice the outcome is similar. He said, Myra, you're extraordinary. She looked at him with the steady gray eyes, and something moved in them. Not the practical self this time, the other one. She said, I'm practical. Both, he said, both at the same time. She almost smiled. She picked up the pen. He presented the Tier 2 application to Gruka on the morning of the 3rd day, before the charter appeal period had expired. Gruka received it with the stillness of someone who had not anticipated the specific move, but who was not surprised in any deep sense by being outmaneuvered, because she was too experienced to be surprised. She read it with the focused attention she gave everything, 3 pages of dense documentation, cross-referenced against the Regional Development Charter in ways that were correct and precise, and clearly not the work of someone who had assembled it the night before. When she finished, she said, "You filed this before the assessment." "The documentation was prepared before the assessment," Callum said. "The formal application was filed this morning. The timeline advantages you in the review process." "Yes." She set the application down and looked at him. "Who wrote this?" "My wife." A pause. "She is Ashvin blood, Southern Reach Resettlement." "Yes." The original settlement, Kesever, was assessed 6 years before the Reach expansion. Labor quota, full extraction. Something moved in the flat brass eyes, not quite acknowledgement, not quite apology, but the recognition of a thread connecting 2 points. The children she brought north. Her sister stayed behind to help the elderly during the assessment. She didn't, he stopped. He started again. She didn't make it out. Gruka was quiet for a long moment. "The regional development review will take 60 days, she said. "I will hold the assessment pending review outcome." "That's all I ask." She looked at him with that flat, measuring attention. Then she said, "The assessment team is not your enemy, Sergeant." "I know that. We are a function of the system we operate within. The system has incentives that produce outcomes like this one. It is not a reflection of personal animus." "I know that too." He met her eyes. "But the people on that list are my people. That makes their outcomes personal, regardless of the systemic cause." She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "If the reclassification proceeds, Ashwick will be required to maintain its metrics consistently. I will personally recommend the application to the Regional Development Division. I cannot guarantee the outcome." "I understand." She turned and walked back to the square. He watched her go. Then he turned and went to find Myra, who was at the grain office table running the tribute calculations for the Tier 2 metrics documentation, because the appeal had 60 days and the metrics window started now. The review took 47 days, not 60. Callum spent those 47 days learning things he hadn't known he was learning. He learned that Gruka came back to the grain office window on the 4th day of the wait and asked Myra a series of detailed questions about the resilience architecture she designed, the drought monitoring system, the grain storage expansion, the apprenticeship pipeline. He learned this because Davin told him, wide-eyed, that the lead assessor had been standing at the office window for 2 hours taking notes. He learned that Myra had been corresponding with the Regional Development Division for 14 months through the public charter records process, building a documented relationship with the 2 analysts responsible for the Southern March's sustainability metrics. She had been sending them quarterly reports on Ashwick's resource management outcomes, framed as voluntary settlement performance data. They had been responding. There was a correspondence file in the 3rd cabinet drawer, 42 letters deep. 14 months, he said when she showed him. "I told you. I prefer to build the architecture before the emergency." You were building a relationship with the collective's development analysts while simultaneously complying with the assessment requirements. "The 2 things are not in conflict," she said. "Compliance is necessary. It's not sufficient." He thought about what his deputy had said years ago about the face, the specific expression he put on when he was managing a situation. He realized, sitting in the grain office with the 42 letters in front of him, that Myra had a version of it too. He had been looking at it for 4 years and calling it practicality. It was not only practicality. It was the same thing under a different name. The decision to be steady and to keep working, and to not allow the size of the problem to be a reason to stop. The review letter arrived on the 47th day. It bore the Regional Development Division seal, not the assessment team's stamp, which was already a signal. It confirmed the Tier 2 reclassification, reduced the labor quota by 60%, and extended the assessment cycle to 3 years. It also contained a paragraph that Myra read 3 times without speaking, which was unusual enough that he leaned across the table to see what it said. It was an invitation. The Regional Development Division was expanding its settlement advisory program and was seeking contracted charter analysts with demonstrated expertise in sustainable resource management for client settlements in the Southern Marches. The position was external, contracted, not full collective employment, and it paid a provincial charter salary. "This is a collective appointment," Myra said. "It is. Working with the collective's development side, on the sustainability metrics, from inside the process." "Yes." She was very still. "At the charter drafting level," she said, "there are 3 exemption clauses that are producing bad outcomes. The labor quota methodology, the social stability exemption definitions, and the dependency classification criteria. They could be changed. Not dramatically, you can't rewrite them wholesale and expect approval, but the language can be adjusted, incrementally, in ways that are defensible on efficiency grounds." "Which you would know how to do," he said. "Which I have been thinking about for 3 years. He looked at her, she looked at the letter. "Lena is 12, she said. "Tam is 9. They need you, not every minute of every day, but they need you." "Yes," she was quiet. "I need to think about the structure, whether it's possible to do the work without, if there was a way to maintain the base here while." "Myra," he put his hand over hers, "tell me what you would do if the children weren't a factor." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "I would take the position. I would change the exemption clauses. I would build the model properly, from the inside, and I would make it so that what happened at Ashwick, what happened at Kessever, becomes structurally harder to replicate. Then we figure out the children. You can't manage the township end." "I know people," he said. "Aldrich's daughters would, Myra, they would be honored. And Davin is 20 in 2 months. He's ready for more responsibility than he thinks he is." And he stopped. He started again. "I am not willing to use the children as a reason for you to not do the work you were made to do. That's not what they'd want either. They know you." She looked at him with the unguarded self, not by accident this time. A choice. "You would come with me," she said. "When the position requires field travel. The charter specifically allows for a secondary staff officer with security qualifications." He kept his voice completely steady. "I have 9 years of constabulary experience. I believe I qualify." Something shifted in her face. Not the practical self and not the other self, but both of them at once together, which was the rarest thing he had ever seen in her. She said, "I fold the quarterly reports correctly." "I know you do. Davin doesn't. I'll teach him." She was quiet for a moment that had weight to it. Then she said, "All right." She took the position. Myra Ashvin. She kept Ashvin for the professional work. It was the name the children knew her by and the name her sister had shared. Became a contracted charter analyst for the Regional Development Division of the Vorgeth Collective's Southern Marches program at the age of 29. She was the first person born in Kessever to hold any form of charter appointment in either province. She was the first resettlement refugee from the Reach expansion to hold an advisory position in the collective's administrative structure in 60 years of recorded history. She did not announce these facts. She went to work. The first exemption clause revision took 14 months. It was a technical adjustment to the social stability dependency definitions, a clarification of what constituted a functional household unit for the purposes of labor assessment exemption that, in practice, expanded the category significantly without changing the surface language dramatically enough to draw opposition from the assessment division's quota advocates. The analysts who approved it understood what it did. They approved it because Myra had spent 14 months making the case on efficiency grounds, with data, and the data was correct. The second revision took 2 years. It was harder because it touched the labor quota methodology directly, a recalibration of the assessment formula that incorporated long-term settlement productivity into the calculation, meaning settlements with strong resilience metrics would generate lower quotas automatically. This was the thing Gruca had told her was impossible, changing the incentive structure of the assessment system from the inside. It was not impossible, it was slow. Callum was with her for most of it. He worked as secondary staff officer on the field visits. There were many field visits, because the advisory program required her to assess and support settlements throughout the marches, and assessments required someone who understood both charter procedure and the practical security dimensions of arriving at a vulnerable community with collective credentials. He was, by his own assessment, useful. By Myra's assessment, indispensable, although she would not say so directly, and he learned to read the evidence. The third revision took 3 years and was the most consequential. It changed the dependency classification criteria in a way that, combined with the first 2 revisions, made the original Kessiver-style assessment, full extraction, no meaningful exemptions, functionally impossible under standard charter procedure. You could still do it, technically, if you were willing to navigate a significant compliance burden. But the burden was large enough that the calculus shifted. It became more efficient to pursue the sustainable model. No one gave a speech about it. The revision passed in a regional charter committee review, filed under administrative clarifications, attended by 11 people, 9 of whom were primarily thinking about the lunch break. In the settlements of the southern marches over the following decade, the labor assessment pattern changed. Slowly, these things were always slow, but measurably. Settlement populations stabilized. Tribute payments became more reliable. The regional development division's long-term productivity metrics improved. 40,000 people lived different lives because of 3 revisions to 4 paragraphs of charter language. Most of them would never know why. Gruca retired in the 48th year of her assessment service. By then, she was one of the most senior collective field officers in the Southern Marches, a position she had reached through consistent competence and the particular respect that accrues to people who never pretend to be different from what they are. She received a senior administrator's pension and a citation from the Collective Council. She accepted them without ceremony, because ceremony was not something she had ever had use for. She spent her first year of retirement in her home city, in a house with a northern window, cataloging the settlement records she had accumulated across 48 years of field work. She was meticulous about the catalog. It was, she thought, the most honest thing she had ever built, a record of what had actually happened, as opposed to what the official reports said had happened. In the 48th year, she sent one letter. It went to Ashwick Station, addressed to the settlement officer, Davin, who was 30 now and managing the grain office with a methodical competence that surprised people who had known him at 17, though it would not have surprised Myra, who had seen it coming. The letter said, "I have kept records of every assessment I conducted in 48 years of field service. Ashwick Station appears in my records 6 times. The initial assessment that was resolved by bond registration and emergency exemption filing, 4 subsequent reviews under the Tier 2 reclassification, and the final review under the revised quota formula, which produced a zero extraction outcome. In 48 years, Ashwick is the only settlement in my record that has achieved a zero extraction outcome. It is the only assessment that produced a bond registration on the day of assessment, and the administrator who was registered on that day has, in my professional assessment, changed the structure of the Southern Marches Charter framework more than any other individual in the past 20 years, though the changes were made quietly enough that few people could attribute them. The collective has 48 years of data and 1 outlier. The outlier, as it has always been, is more instructive than the data. I have never had occasion to say this in my professional career. I say it now. The people of Ashwick Station, and particularly those who managed its affairs during the assessment years, were an education. I was, in some measure, a better officer for having been obliged to contend with them. The settlement should know this. Davin read the letter twice. He was sitting at the grain office table, at the same table where Callum and Myra had registered the charter bond 17 years before, where Myra had spread the Tier 2 documentation and built the architecture that it held. The ledger where the registration was recorded was in the cabinet behind him, worn at the spine from handling. He thought about sending the letter on to Myra. She was in the capital now, working on what she called the third phase, the assessment methodology reform, which was her largest project and the one she expected to take 5 more years. Callum had come home to Ashwick 2 years ago when the field work eased, and his knee made travel genuinely inadvisable, and he was sitting in the constabulary right now, probably working through the monthly security reports and probably not folding them correctly. Davin decided to let Myra come to the letter when she came home for the spring harvest review, which she always did. He filed it carefully in the third cabinet drawer, between the quarterly reports, in the place where important things went to be preserved. He folded the quarterly reports properly. Then he thought about Gruka's letter and unfolded them and folded them wrong, just once, as a small act of honoring something he couldn't have named if someone had asked him to. Then he folded them right and went back to work. In the spring, Myra came home. She came on a Tuesday, in the way she always arrived, no announcement, just the sound of the mount in the yard and then her voice at the grain office window asking Davin whether he'd fixed the discrepancy in the winter grain accounts. He had. She inspected his work, found it satisfactory, and went across the lane to the constabulary. Callum was at his desk. He looked up when she came in, and then he looked at her the way he had been looking at her for 17 years, with the full attention he had never learned to moderate and had stopped trying to. She sat down across from him and said, "The third revision passed committee review." "I heard. It takes effect in the autumn assessment cycle." "I heard that too." She looked at him with the steady gray eyes. "The work in the capital is, there are 2 more revisions I want to propose before the end of the decade. The dependency criteria are still." "Myra." She stopped. "You've been traveling for 4 months," he said. "The revision passed. 40,000 people are going to have a different kind of life because of work you did quietly in a series of meetings that nobody attended. Your niece is coming for dinner tomorrow. Your nephew sent a letter from the Survey Corps last week that I have been saving for you." He looked at her across the desk. "Can the capital wait until Thursday?" She looked at him. The unguarded self was there and the practical self and something else, the version of her that had lived 17 years in Ashwick with him and had become, over all those years, something she hadn't been when she arrived. Not softer, not less precise, just more rooted, more certain of the ground under her. She said Thursday. "Thank you." She reached into her bag and put a document on his desk. He looked at it. A charter filing, dense with legal language, the Regional Development Division seal at the top. "This one," she said, "is personal." He picked it up and read the title. Proposed Amendment to Provincial Charter, Appendix 7, Settlement Officer Authority Review, Permanent Reclassification of Kessiver Settlement Site. He looked up at her. "Kessiver was decommissioned after the assessment," she said. Her voice was level. "Officially classified as an unsustainable extraction site. The designation was never reversed because nobody thought to reverse it, and because the collective doesn't revisit old classifications without a formal challenge." She met his eyes. "If the classification is reversed, the site can be formally recognized as a resettlement origin point. There's a memorial provision in the charter for settlements that were depopulated under extraction conditions. If the depopulation is formally acknowledged, there can be a recognized site, a named place." He understood what she was asking for. Not for herself. Myra never asked for things for herself. For her sister. For the people who hadn't walked north. For Powder and the other people who had become names in the public charter records without anyone reversing the circumstances that put them there. "You've been building this filing for how long?" he said.
6 years, she said.
He looked at the document. Then he picked up his pen and said, "What do you need me to sign?" She told him. Outside, the spring light was warm on the Ashwick Square, and the grain office was open, and Davin was tallying the winter accounts correctly, and somewhere down the lane Aldrich's granddaughter was learning cooperage from a grandmother who had, 17 years ago, signed a charter bond as a witness, and counted it one of the finest things she'd ever been present for. The South Road was quiet. It had been quiet for a long time now. The Vorgeth assessment team still traveled it. They still came to Ashwick on the 3-year cycle, with the bronze-banded harnesses and the draft mounts and the assessment tables. They came, and they checked the metrics, and they signed the Tier 1 documentation, and they went. They had been doing this for 11 years, without taking a single person. Myra signed the bottom of the Kessiver filing, and passed it across the desk to Callum. He signed below her, in the witness column. She took it back, folded it precisely, and set it in her bag with the care she gave everything that mattered. Then she looked out the constabulary window at the square in the spring light, at the township that had survived, because the people who loved it had been stubborn and precise, and willing to stay water when everything around them was trying to be stone. She said, "It'll take 2 years, the reversal process." "We have 2 years," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "We do. There is something the Vorgeth Collective never put in their assessment data, a variable their 48 years of settlement records could not measure because they had no instrument calibrated for it. Not intelligence, exactly. Not stubbornness. Something in between, or something that contains both without being either. The collective had a word for it in their own language, a sound like a stone settling into deep water, which the translation registers approximated as settled force, the quality of a thing that does not resist pressure by pushing back, but rather by becoming so fully and completely what it is that the pressure has nowhere to go. A wall can be broken. Water can only be redirected. The collective's 48 years of data had studied the wall settlements and the crumbling ones, and the ones that bent and the ones that folded, and Gruka had said it in her letter, and she had said it right. The outlier was more instructive than the data. What the data couldn't capture was the grain office at midnight, Davin holding the lantern, Callum across the table from Myra with everything he'd been not saying for 2 years finally said, and Myra's pen moving even while she was deciding, because she had never been the kind of person who stopped working just because the most important thing was happening. Both things at once. Always both things at once. What the data couldn't capture was Lena at 12, watching her aunt take a collective advisory position and understanding. Not in the way of children who are told things, but in the way of children who see. That the world was something you could argue with, if you knew the language and were willing to do the tedious work of learning every word. What the data couldn't capture was Tam at 9, sitting on the hill above the township with Callum one evening while Myra was away at the Capitol, asking why his aunt cared so much about paperwork, and Callum saying, "She doesn't care about the paperwork. She cares about the people the paperwork is about. The paperwork is just the only tool that reaches far enough." What the data couldn't capture was the pressed flower in the carved box, brown with age by now, kept not as a relic but as a reminder, the kind of reminder that has no content except, "This mattered, this still matters, the mattering doesn't stop." The charter revisions are law now. The Kessiver Memorial was formally recognized in the autumn of the year Myra turned 43. A small ceremony, attended by 12 people, at the site that the charter now described as a resettlement origin point, a place where people had lived and been scattered and were still, in some form, accounted for. Myra stood at the edge of the site in the morning air with Lena and Tam on either side of her, and said nothing that anyone recorded, because some things are not speeches. The settlement of Ashwick is on the third cycle of its Tier 1 designation now. The grain bins hold 6 months' supply. The drought monitoring system has been upgraded twice. The apprenticeship program has 68 active registrations. Davin runs the grain office with the methodical precision Myra always knew he was capable of, and he folds the quarterly reports correctly, and he keeps Gruka's letter in the third cabinet drawer where it has always been. The Vorgath assessment team comes every 3 years. They check the metrics, they sign the documentation, they leave. On the South Road, going back the way they came, they pass through country that is different from the country Gruka traveled 48 years ago, and different from the country that Myra's sister walked north through in the resettlement, and different from the country that 2 children crossed on their way to an Ashwick grain office, and a constable who needed his filing system reorganized. Not different in the way of a conquered place. Different in the way of a place where the water kept moving, and the stone wore down, and the path that was there eventually became the path that everyone took, without anyone being able to point to the exact moment when the turning happened. Which is, perhaps, the only kind of change that lasts. The carved box is in the second drawer of the desk in Myra's home office, where she does her work in the evenings, the ongoing work, the third phase work, the revisions she is building for the decade to come. It holds a button, a stone, a letter, and a flower. It has held these things for 30 years, and it will hold them for 30 more. She does not need to open it often, but sometimes, in the long evenings when the work is slow and the problem is hard and the path is not yet clear, she opens it and looks at what's inside for a minute or two, without moving, and then she closes it and picks up her pen and keeps going. The water stays water. That is enough. That is, in the end, everything. Lena became a ceramicist. This surprised everyone except Myra, who had watched her niece's hands from the time she was small. The particular attention she gave to the shape of things, the way she handled objects with a care that was not delicacy but precision, the awareness that form determined function and that function was what mattered. Ceramics made sense. It was the kind of skill that required patience and fire and a willingness to accept that most of what you made would not survive the kiln, and you made it anyway, because the ones that did were worth it. She registered as an apprentice under Ashwick's emergency program in the crisis year, when she was 12 years old and the paperwork was a desperate improvisation. She never stopped. She became a master ceramicist at 23, the youngest registered in the marches. She taught her own apprentices with the methodical rigor she had learned from a woman who had taught her, among other things, that teaching was not the transmission of knowledge, but the creation of capacity. You gave people not what you knew, but the tools to know more than you did. She had 4 apprentices active at any given time, because that was the charter maximum, and she believed in using the law the way the law was meant to be used, fully, without waste. Tam became a surveyor. This surprised no one who had watched him as a child. He had always been drawn to the edges of things, the places where the maps ran out and the territory continued. He worked for the Provincial Survey Corps for 6 years and then established an independent practice, which allowed him to work in the places the Corps didn't go, the small settlements between settlements, the communities that existed in the gaps of the official record. He made maps. He submitted copies to the provincial archive and copies to Myra, who filed them in the charter documentation for the third phase project, because maps of where people actually lived were relevant to the question of how to protect them. He sent letters regularly, from wherever the work took him. The letters were long and detailed, and often contained small sketches of landscapes or geological features that interested him. Myra read them and kept them in a file in the desk drawer beside the carved box. Callum read them and read them aloud sometimes to Aldrich, who was old now but still sharp, and who had 3 granddaughters in the township and a great-grandchild on the way, and who considered himself, in the accounting of his life, a fortunate man. The township had a square. It had always had a square, but it had acquired over the years the particular quality of a place where things happened that were remembered. The assessment tables had stood there, and the bond registration had been performed in the office that faced it, and the Tier 1 reclassification had been announced there on a spring morning with Davin crying again and Aldrich standing very still. It was not a monument. It was a place where people crossed in the morning going to work and in the evening coming home, and where children ran and where the market set up on Tuesdays, and where, if you knew the history, you could feel the presence of the things that had happened there without it being a weight, because the things that had happened were the reason the crossing was possible. Callum sat in the square sometimes, in the evenings when the light was good, watching the township move. He was 51 now, with the gray at his temples that had been coming for years, and a knee that told him what the weather was going to do before the clouds arrived. He had been constable of Ashwick for 22 years, which was either an unremarkable career or a remarkable one, depending on what you were counting. He counted it by the people, the ones who were still here, the ones who had grown up here and gone out to do their work in the world, the ones who came back. Myra came back for the spring harvest review every year, and for the autumn assessment cycle, and sometimes in between when the work in the capital allowed it, which was not often but was more than it had been when the children were young, and the advisory work was still establishing itself. The time between visits was different now from what it had been in the early years, less absence and more continuance. The understanding that a thing ongoing didn't require constant physical proximity to remain intact. She brought work with her always. He had made peace with this a long time ago, because it was not a competition but a nature. She was built for purpose the way he was built for steadiness, and love between two people was not the surrender of what you were but the accommodation of it, the construction of a shared space that had room for both shapes. She brought work and he made tea, and sometimes they worked in the same room without speaking for hours, which was its own form of intimacy, the kind that is only possible after years. The evening she came home with the Kessever approval, the formal reversal of the settlement's extraction classification, signed by the Deputy Provincial Commissioner, countersigned by the Regional Development Division. She came straight to the constabulary from the South Road, still in her travel clothes, and she put the document on his desk and stood by the window and looked out at the square. He looked at the document. Then he looked at her back, at her shoulders, at the way she was standing, the upright carriage she had arrived with 20 years ago, that had never changed in all the years between, that he had learned to read the way a sailor reads weather. He came and stood beside her. The square was quiet in the evening light. The grain office was dark. The cooperage was dark. The lights were coming on in the houses one by one, the small, ordinary domestic fires of a township at the end of a day, people coming home.
"It took 2 years," she said.
"Yes. It should have taken 6 months. The review process is structured to discourage. They put obstacles in the pathway deliberately and you have to—" She stopped. She started again. "It is done." "Yes. She'll have a named place." He put his arm around her. She leaned into him, and he felt her let go of something she had been holding for a long time, not all of it, not permanently, because some things you carry always and the carrying becomes part of you. But the acute part of it, the part that had been waiting for a resolution that only the reversal could provide. "Tell me about her," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she was funny. "People always think I'm the practical one and she was the emotional one, but she was funny. She had a way of finding the absurd thing in a situation and naming it without cruelty. She used to say that most problems were either funny or tragic and the difference was mostly timing." A small pause. She would have liked this, the bureaucratic reversal, the dense charter language, the 12-person ceremony. She would have said all that in 12 people, Myra, and made a face. He laughed. It was a short sound, real. She would have liked you, Myra said. She liked stubborn, practical people who had the sense to know what they were looking at. He held her in the quiet constabulary with the window open to the evening, and the square below them peaceful in the last of the light. The south road ran out of sight between the houses, going toward the reach, going toward the places that were different now from what they had been, not fixed, not perfect, but different in the ways that mattered, in the ways that had been bought by the tedious and invisible work of changing 4 paragraphs in a charter that most people would never read. Outside, the night was settling in. Somewhere down the lane, Aldrich's grandchildren were being called home. Davin's lamp was still lit in the grain office window, which meant he was working late, which meant the winter accounts had a discrepancy that needed chasing. The stars were beginning, faint and then bright, the way they always were, the way they had been above Kessever and above the North Road, and above this square for longer than anyone had been counting. Myra said, "The 3rd revision." "Which one is that?" "The one that changes the quota formula itself, not the exemptions, not the reclassification criteria, the fundamental formula, the way the collective calculates what a settlement owes." She was looking out the window, but he knew she was also looking at the shape of the work in front of her, the architecture she was building in her mind. "It's the largest one. It will take 5 years, maybe more." 5 years, he said. "At least." "We have 5 years," he said. She turned and looked at him with the steady gray eyes, the unguarded self, the practical self, both of them together, which was the face he had loved first and had gone on loving for 20 years with no diminishment and no condition and no end in sight. "Yes," she said. The lamp in the grain office went out. Davin was done for the night. The square was quiet. "We have a great deal more than 5 years," Callum said. She held his eyes for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, we do." And outside the window in the Ashwick Square, in the settled evening of a township that had been fought for and maintained and was still here, the last of the light went gold and then went, and the night came in, and the world was quiet, and it was enough.